on your side. WBTV News on Bounce starts right now.
Good evening and welcome on this Monday. I'm Brigida Mack.
And I'm Delano Little. Thank you for joining us tonight for Race and Justice, a community conversation.
And you know, we wanted to take this opportunity to delve into something that we talk about so much here on the news when it comes to Charlotte. Just a few weeks ago, the Charlotte community came together to discuss solutions for the negative overrepresentation of African Americans in the penal and justice system.
Yeah, and tonight we're bringing the conversation here to WBTV News on Bounce. We want to introduce some of the great minds in the legal community joining us tonight. We have Mecklenburg County District Attorney Spencer Merriweather and retired Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Detective of 30 years, Garry McFadden. He's also the host of I Am Homicide on Investigation Discovery. Welcome, gentlemen.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you here tonight.
Glad to be here.
We will also speak to civil rights attorney Anita Earls, civil rights attorney James Ferguson, there in the middle, and Mecklenburg District Court Judge Kim Best. So thank you all for being here tonight as well. We're going to hear from everyone over the course of this hour, but we want to dive right in. We want to talk about one particular arrest in Mecklenburg County, possession of marijuana. Why is this a problem?
Well, I'll tell you that there are many different ways that we try to deal with marijuana cases as they come in the door. As a matter of law, marijuana cases are a low priority for the state of North Carolina. So that gives us a lot of different options as to how we handle those cases. When an officer makes an arrest on a case like that, the district attorney possesses the possibility of dismissing that case upon someone attending a drug class, or we have the possibility of giving someone a misdemeanor resolution to that case as well. So there are a number of different things we can do depending on the record of the person who's actually been arrested.
Which race sees the most arrests, and which race sees the least amount, and why is that, and why would that be?
The best way to answer that question is that without question, African Americans and people of color are disproportionately impacted by our criminal justice system. And that's not unique to marijuana cases, it's not unique to any particular type of case. That's just true across the board. So there are certainly things, and I think we'll get into some of that about how it is that we address that particular problem.
And we also know that the district attorney's office cannot decide to indict or not to charge. What goes into that decision?
So we do actually decide whether or not to indict or not indict. What we don't decide to do is whether to arrest or not to arrest. And so when an arrest comes in the door, there are two things that are required of the district attorney. First, to decide whether or not the evidence actually exists to proceed in that case. And the second thing is to decide what should be the outcome. There are going to be many times when it's a child, when it's a teenager who actually comes before the court, and we decide this is a youthful indiscretion and we should handle it that way, meaning that give that person an opportunity to keep their record clean. There are going to be some other times when we realize that it's someone who's selling marijuana out somebody's house, and you don't want someone getting shot over that, and the only recourse that you may have is to actually hold that person accountable in a court of law.
And Garry McFadden, I want to bring you into the conversation because I know you spent so much time with CMPD over your career. How do officers come across these types of suspects? Traffic stops, is it warrants?
Mostly if it's traffic stop, you know, you stop someone for a tail light and then the aroma comes from the car. And then you see drug paraphernalia on the seat. Then you get into a question answer thing, and then you get into the arrest after that. And most people don't know this, that actually officers can write a citation for simple possession of marijuana and you on your way. But other things kind of complicate that decision, you know, whether you give your name, you know, some other things on the scene, people on the scene may complicate that. But simply we can just write a ticket and they'll be on their merry way.
What kind of things would complicate it to the point where they can't just get off with a citation and it's something where it goes toward an arrest and putting them in, you know, to the system?
That would be a gun on the seat, gun under the seat, open container in the car, underage, driving while license revoked, driving with no license. All those things complicate that single just signing a citation and letting them go.
Also, what type of charge does possession of marijuana carry?
So it is a Class 3 misdemeanor. As a matter of fact, you cannot even go to prison for simple possession of marijuana.
And the average cost of bail for marijuana charges?
Well, for a Class 3 possession case, there is a policy that's recently been instituted by our local judges, which basically says that if you have fewer than 5 previous convictions, you can be released from custody with a written promise to reappear. So there will be no secured bond.
Okay.
And how long can a person sit in jail? And is that uniform? Is it 2 days or 3 days, and it's for everybody, or does it differ?
Well, again, if it's that possession of marijuana case, in fact, they won't actually be in custody or be in jail for a minute.
Right.
It's a matter of once they see a magistrate, they're sent on their way upon that written promise to reappear.
Okay. All right. The war on drugs was declared back in 1971 by President Nixon. Do we need harsher penalties, or should our justice system lighten up a bit on this?
We got to do more than lighten up. What I think we've learned the hard way as a society is that when we talk about drugs, we're really talking about a health problem, not a crime problem. The crime comes into play when you have people that are preying on people's health problem. That's when it becomes a crime. And as your district attorney's office, that's what we're actually trying to make sure is a priority in our courts.
Okay. Suggestions? What would you vote?
I think it's education in schools, education at home. Most of the schools that I attend and talk to kids, they do not see marijuana as a drug. You know, they just see it as something that they use. And so that gives them, you know, less responsibility for it.
I know there's a lot of debate about this. Is there a thought that this should be legalized? Would that sort of clear this out and make room for other, you know, higher priorities when it comes to crime in our community?
Well, I think when our legislature decides to make that part of their agenda, that'll be a very interesting conversation for us to have. In the meantime, both people who are in law enforcement as well as those of us who work in our courts have to follow the laws that are actually on the books. But I do agree that there are increasing forums where there are such conversations.
Any other common arrests in Mecklenburg County? Because we were thinking that possession of marijuana was the most common. We found out that that's not the case. There are other, you know, a lot of common arrests.
Sadly, I think a lot of people who live in communities across Mecklenburg County will tell you that they are alarmed by the number of break-ins, alarmed by the number of larcenies. The key is, why is it that people are actually breaking in and committing these larcenies? And sometimes it is related to drug addiction. Other times it's related to people who are just trying to steal your stuff. And again, we have to deal with those accordingly and make sure that we're coming out with the right outcome.
And I know I covered CMPD for a lot of years when I was on the streets as a reporter, and it's a crime of opportunity in many ways as well.
It is. You know, most of the time people watch people leave. But the problem is, if you break in that house and somebody's in there, sleep, then it becomes a major problem. And that's the simple B&E turns it down to a first-degree burglary. That's when it's a problem.
Okay. But it's something that obviously you guys continue to combat. I feel like education, you know, we always talking to police about, you know, what people can do to try to keep themselves from, you know, becoming the next target.
And we do. We try each and every day to say, this is what you shouldn't do. But I think educating kids in school and talking to kids about what they should not do and what the consequences that they will face is a big part too.
People can make themselves less vulnerable, and that certainly needs to be part of our focus, but we also need to be addressing the underlying causes of crime. And sometimes that's going to mean punishing people, and other times it's going to be meeting the needs that people, the lack of resources that brought people into that criminal behavior in the first place.
Gentlemen, thank you for that segment. Next up, we're addressing what takes place during court appearances. The conversation continues next on Balance. Welcome back to Race and Justice, a community conversation. The next topic we want to discuss is about court appearances. One particular arrest, possession of marijuana. We talked about that. For this, we turn to civil rights attorney Anita Earls and retired CMPD detective Garry McFadden still joining us here. First, Anita, if you don't mind, if you can give us a little background into what you've been doing.
Yes. So for 30 years, I've been a civil rights attorney. For the first 10 years of my career, I was here in Charlotte practicing with James Ferguson and the Ferguson Stein Law Firm. Most recently, I was executive director of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, and that's where we've been looking at some of the data around marijuana arrests.
All right. Explain how defense attorneys typically prepare clients for court, if you will.
Well, that's an interesting question. A lot depends on the time that they have, but certainly you want to know as much as you can about your client's background. their community, what kind of support they have, as well as, of course, all the circumstances surrounding their arrest and what has happened with them, and their own expectations and what they want to, what would be an ideal situation for them. Those are all, if you have the time, those are the kinds of things you'd want to work with your client on.
And I know that even though you spent several years in Charlotte, you've now been working extensively in Durham, North Carolina, not far from here, and you have examples of marijuana arrests among college students. And we want to take a look first, because you provided us with some great visuals, at the black population in Durham County. So you see that there. And then the next map shows marijuana arrests across several cities near Durham County. And those are the black marks that are on top of that map. And then the last map shows a close-up of Durham, and the blue icon on the left represents Duke University students, and the red icon represents the number of North Carolina Central University students. Of course, that's a historically black college and university, and there are more arrests near Central. So, Anita, to you, what is striking about the visuals here?
Right. So this data is a little bit dated. Each dot does represent a single arrest for marijuana possession. The darker shaded areas are the higher concentration of African American population. And what it really does is it visualizes for us the disparities in arrests around Central's campus, whereas not nearly so many arrests around Duke's campus. And yet what we do know from research is that whites and African Americans are using marijuana at the same rates, in fact slightly higher among white populations. So that this is just a visual representation of numbers that show the disparities in arrests. And I think we focused on arrests in part because arrests for marijuana possession, because that's oftentimes how people first get into the criminal justice system. And then from that flows all sorts of consequences, sometimes collateral consequences that follow them around for the rest of their lives. And so if we can stop that original initial arrest for simple possession of marijuana for someone who has no prior record, we can begin to change lives.
And you pointed out that the usage among whites and black college students is about the same, slightly higher
more, yes.
among white students. Do you think then that that underscores a problem that students of color, black students, are more targeted when it comes to the arrest? Maybe white students are, I don't know if given a pass is the right term, when they come in contact with police versus if you're a person of color coming in contact with.
Well, I think there are a couple of points of discretion, even if you're just looking at the system from, from initial contact with law enforcement through to an arrest being made. There's actually a couple of different points of discretion there. And I think what the data shows is that that discretion has been used in a way that disproportionately impacts students of color.
And that's where we want to bring you into the conversation, Garry, because you're saying that police have the ability just to write a citation, but that there are other things that could complicate that. But is it sometimes no other complication other than, and I'm just going to say it, the color of their skin?
That happens. It happens. And I think that we can combat this if we look at the data and then ask for the patterns and practices from the police department. If we can show that, and then we can address that in a public forum, or we can address that on the campus, or we address that at a meeting with the faculty and staff at the university, I think that we will come out better. But we have to show that the patterns and practices against these two universities show that data, and let's talk about that data, and then we can go forward. But things like that do happen every day.
I would imagine that'd be tough to do, though, as far as trying to get the information on what happened on a particular stop and what made somebody decide they wanted to bring this person in or what or not.
Well, I think we do that now with our traffic stops. You know, we have stop data. So you look at that, and so the officers can just simply put in why he stopped this person, and then if it's for marijuana, if it's for cocaine, then we'll know. I think we look at that data, and then we move forward and say, this is a problem. By looking at this map, you can tell it's a problem. And then we all know college is college. Kids in college are going to do kids in college things. So both campuses are probably doing the same thing, but then one is targeted more than the other.
And I imagine that's where implicit bias comes in. I mean, we've heard CMPD's Chief Kerr Putney talk about that, and that's a difficult thing to address and then try to rectify within police departments, not just here, but I think across the country.
Right. But that's when you look at patterns and practices. And you take that data and look at it and say, something is wrong. This is a red flag. This person is stopping all people of color.
Gotcha.
Then we can say, we need to address this problem. And that's what we need to do.
Well, and I think in North Carolina we're really fortunate that we have this resource. Over 10 years ago, the legislature passed a law saying that you have to keep traffic stop data, not only the race of the person being stopped, but also the reason, whether or not there was a search, whether or not there was an arrest. And we now have over 10 years of data. It's been collated on a website, opendatapolicing.org, and anyone can go and look at their individual police department. If they've been stopped by an officer, they can look and find that traffic stop and determine what that officer's pattern has been, and that's actually been a tool for defense attorneys as well.
I'm sorry, reiterate the name of that website again.
It's called opendatapolicing.org.
Okay. Because I think people would be surprised to know not only does that exist, but that there is a law on the books that, you know, is helping just complete the picture, if you will.
Well, I think that we have to move away from these forums where we're just yelling and screaming, you know, the police did this, the police did that. Bring the data, show the data. Let's talk about it. Now we have a problem. Now we need to target that problem, target that officer, target that agency. Say, this is a problem, bring it to their attention, we move forward with it.
Very interesting. All right, well, up next, alarming statistics showing the jail and prison population across the nation and right here in Mecklenburg County. The conversation continues next on Bounce.
Welcome back to Race and Justice, a community conversation. Right now we want to examine the jail and prison population, not only in the United States, but also right here in Mecklenburg County with Judge Kim Best of the Mecklenburg County District Court. She has been sitting on the court for 10 years with the district court here in the county, as well as Attorney James Ferguson II, who is a civil rights icon. So thank you to you both for being here. We certainly appreciate it. First to you, Judge Best. Just a little bit about yourself.
Well, I've been presiding over juvenile matters and criminal matters. I've been a district court judge since 2009, and I have to throw in a shameless plug. I'm a proud Wolverine, go blue. I hope we win tonight. But I've primarily been presiding in those courts. I currently preside over family law matters, but I am a certified juvenile judge and have been active in this community conversation. I'm also on the board for Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, which is one of our community programs that takes a look at this entire concept and this issue, and has actually served in collaborative manner with our local police force and others to try and help create solutions to this issue of race and disproportionality and implicit bias.
And over to you, Mr. Ferguson, just a little bit about yourself.
I'm James Ferguson. I've practiced law here in Mecklenburg County for the past 51 years with my law firm, which has concentrated a lot of its work on racial issues, including the criminal justice system, but for school, every aspect of society, because over the period of time that I've been practicing law, what I've seen is shifting sands when it comes to race, but race is still with us too much.
So we want to start with the charts that Judge Best shared at that panel discussion, and I want you to walk us through these, Judge, starting with how many people are locked up in the United States, and we see that here on the screen.
Well, in the United States, what we see is that we have approximately 1.3 million plus. It's actually more like 2.3 million persons locked up at any given time. But this chart shows that in our state prisons, we have approximately 1.3 million at any given time, but this doesn't take into account our federal prisons, our local jails, our detention centers, and even our mental health facilities, which unfortunately sometimes serve as detention options comparatively to our prisons and our state correctional facilities.
Is that number staggering? I mean, are the numbers staggering to you?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. As everyone knows, the United States jails and houses more prisoners, more criminals than any other developed country in the world. So it is staggering. You know, for us to be a developed country, you would think that we would have more solutions to this issue and we wouldn't have to house so many individuals who are accused of crimes.
Well, the next one is a breakdown by race and ethnicity in the Mecklenburg County Jail as of March 20th.
Well, as of March 20th, as you can see here, there are approximately 1,400 plus individuals who were incarcerated in our Mecklenburg County Jail. And as you can see, 987 over 50% of them were African American. Of that number, approximately 91% were actually males. So you have this continuing issue of disproportionality of African American males between the ages of 25 and 34 who are housing our jails, are being housed in our jails. And what you will also see is that on average, these charts, none of them actually reveal the churn. We have over 10,000 individuals going in and out of our correctional facilities each year. But this is just a snapshot. In December of 2007, we had approximately 22,000 individuals leave our state prisons and other facilities and return to various communities throughout the state with possibly with those collateral consequences and no reentry services to allow them to fully integrate back into our society as productive citizens.
And I know, Mr. Ferguson, you can speak to this, obviously, representing so many over the years, seeing this sort of revolving door in the Mecklenburg County Jail and how many disproportionately, you know, it's persons of color and black men.
No question that African American males, young males, are grossly overrepresented in our prisons and jails. As Judge Best mentioned, we incarcerate more people per capita than any other civilized country in the world. You would think that if incarceration was really a deterrent to crime, that we would have the lowest crime rate. It's just the opposite. We have very high crime rates as we incarcerate more and more people. So we've got to find some other way to address this besides locking people up.
Judge Best, back to you. Here's one showing the jail population based off gender. Your thoughts on this?
Well, it consistently shows you, as I stated previously, that males are predominantly considered to be the offenders. What are the reasons behind that? We don't know. However, I don't want the community and the listeners to neglect the fact that a increasing number of individuals who are housed in our state prison facilities as well as our federal facilities are females. And I know we're talking about race and justice, but we also have an opioid epidemic going on, a health crisis right now. And a lot of the individuals who are involved in that crisis are actually females. And I've had several cases where those individuals, and I've actually had 2 cases where unfortunately those individuals were found deceased as a result of an overdose from opiates. But our female population is not to be neglected. And unfortunately, a lot of our services are for the men and those individuals who, are coming out of our prison systems, and we're neglecting our ladies. 9% are women. And I would dare suspect that that number is increasing.
So we need to, just like we're having services that are geared toward men, we need to make sure for women as well.
We absolutely.
And is it a situation? I've always wondered this because you hear about these stories. There are high-profile ones of women that had a relationship with the man who may have been sort of the centerpiece of the case, but they get pulled into it and held just as much, responsibility, if you will, if not more so, and they might have been, acquainted with the offender or in a relationship or, I don't know, drove the getaway car. And I'm interested to hear you guys' thoughts on that when it comes to the women who are in our jails and prisons.
Oftentimes, domestic violence plays a part in that, and I don't think we can ignore the fact that domestic violence plays a part in those relationships. So a lot of those women are scared of the individuals, of the intimate partners that they are involved in. That is not to excuse their behavior or to say that this is a reason for it, but we have to understand that power dynamic that's going on. Other than that, I'm not sure of the reason behind a lot of these statistics. I know, once again, the opiate crisis is one issue that is hitting women very hard, and that we need to pay special attention. But outside of that, when we talk about the intimate partner getting involved in those high-profile cases, they're just that. They're high-profile cases. They are not your run-of-the-mill cases, I would dare state.
Well, I think you also find that just as race is an issue when it comes to crime in general, many of the women that you see who are incarcerated are women of color. The statistics are much show that it's a much higher rate of African American women being incarcerated than white women. Yet, the opioid crisis is relatively new, being recognized as part of the criminal justice system, and we also find that it is being treated differently. When the crack cocaine epidemic, so to speak, came out, you saw black folks going to jail in droves.
Right.
Now that we talk about opioid problems, people are talking about this health problem, public health problem. And it is a public health problem.
So is crack cocaine.
As opposed to crack cocaine, which is also a public health problem. Marijuana is a public health issue. So I think and hope that we're getting away from this notion that somehow we solve every problem of society by incarcerating people, and too often incarcerating African Americans. I think, and I know we are moving in a progressive direction in that regard. I think you've got about 8 states now where the possession of marijuana is no longer a crime. And I think you've got about 28 or 30 states where marijuana is not a crime under certain circumstances. A lot of that's medical marijuana. It's used for medical purposes. So pretty soon, I hope, we'll come to the point where we're no longer criminalizing marijuana. And neither should we criminalize opioids and other problems which indicate that people are subject to human frailties such as addiction. And we ought to treat that as a public health problem and approach it in that way.
Well, we're going to keep it moving along because
Right.
we're getting a
We
lot
can
of
talk
good
about
information.
this.
I'm telling you. We have a couple more segments we want to get in. So coming up next, we're breaking down the way race can impact how a person is treated in the criminal justice system. The conversation continues next on Bounce. Welcome back to Race and Justice, a community conversation. We want to dive deeper into how our drug laws are enforced. Civil rights attorney James Ferguson is back with us. Are drug laws enforced equally among races?
No, absolutely not. And that's true not just here in Mecklenburg County, but nationally. You may recall the book that Michelle Alexander recently wrote, Mass Incarceration. When you look at drug statistics all over the country, you find there's a very gross disproportion of African Americans who are arrested for drug crimes, particularly marijuana, compared to whites, although I think Anita Earls, my former law partner, commented that the proportion of use among the races is about the same, maybe a little higher for whites, but yet the rates of incarceration are staggering when it comes to the high number of African Americans who are arrested for drug offenses and the number of whites by comparison.
And I also want to take a look at one of the charts that Judge Kim Best put together for us that we didn't get to the last segment. It shows the average profile in Mecklenburg County, and you can see here on the screen, African American, male, ages 25 to 34, charged with a felony, typically awaiting trial, and at the average stay behind bars, 156 days. So knowing that that's a profile, I'm sure you're very well acquainted with that, given that you've been practicing law in this community for so long. But what are your thoughts seeing that?
Well, it's what we used to call racial profiling. I think now we refer to it more as implicit bias, which operates essentially the same way, where we get this profile in our mind, or this character in our mind of who is violating the law. And too often, it's a young black male. And it's decimating our population among young African-American males who are too often incarcerated. And even if they're not incarcerated, once you're part of the criminal justice system, it's something that follows you the rest of your life. It can affect where you go, whether you can go to college, whether you can have adequate and decent housing, public housing, or whatever you might need, whether you get a job,
whether you can vote.
Whether you can vote. It just affects every aspect of your life, and people take that for granted far too often.
And from the charts that we also saw in the last segment, statistically, there's an overrepresentation of African Americans. Being that you, like you said, practicing law for 50 years, obviously you've seen a lot in that time. And I know that there have been changes up to this point, but do you believe that there will come a time when we won't see that overrepresentation of African Americans?
Well, I have to believe that. Otherwise, I'd just give it all up and stop, go jump off the nearest building or bridge or whatever. But I do think that incrementally, we are moving forward. We're getting better. For one thing, we're talking about it. We've got statistics about it. People are more aware of it than they were 25, 50 years ago. Now, a lot of this is directly related or a direct result of the so-called war on drugs. Back in the, and I think that really started with Nixon and then came into full fruition under President Reagan, where he declared the modern drug war. But before that, you didn't have the huge numbers of people incarcerated that we have in the United States now. And before that, even though there was probably more overt racial discrimination going on, you didn't have the lopsided statistics with African Americans being incarcerated at such a vastly greater rate than whites.
From what you've seen, how are we doing in Mecklenburg County as far as this issue is concerned? Are we ahead of the curve with other counties or across the country?
Well, you know, the statistic that Judge Best showed us a moment ago sort of tell us that we're right in the mix. We're not leading the way. I hope eventually we will begin to lead the way, because I think one thing that is happening in Mecklenburg County is that we are getting more people who are sensitive to race and the role it plays in our criminal justice system than we had, say, 50 years ago when I started practicing, where you had a black DA would have been unheard of at that time. They had no black judges, very few blacks in the criminal justice system. But now we're fortunate in Mecklenburg County to have an African American district attorney, first one. Mm-hmm. And you heard him speak a while ago. He's sensitive to lots of these issues. We have more African Americans on the bench now than we ever had before. And you have people like Judge Best, and they're more sensitive to the issue. And I think that sensitivity is going to move us forward eventually, because as you have more people who are representative of the African American population in positions of power, bringing to it their life's experience, their sensitivity, we move forward. And as we move forward, society as a whole moves forward. So I'm very optimistic about it.
And I think that's what we need, not just persons of color who are in these positions of power, but, you know, white persons in positions who can recognize the problem as well. It
Absolutely.
Can't just be us. We can lead the charge, but we need them to join us. We need them to be just as invested and concerned about the direction that we see this city and the county taking in terms of, you know,
Making
the
a positive
penal and
change.
the criminal
Every
justice.
single person who's involved in administering the criminal justice system has a duty and responsibility to be sensitive, to be knowledgeable, to be understanding, and to reflect that in the decisions that they make that affects the lives of so many of our young people, particularly our African American young people.
Are you seeing that more across the board, that it's not just people that look like you who are concerned?
Fortunately, we are. We have lots of people of the majority race who are sensitive to these issues. And as we move forward, we sensitize more and more of them to this issue. So I think we're getting there slowly, but surely.
It takes time. All right, when we come back, thank you so much for being here again and for hanging around with us, Mr. Ferguson. When we come back, we're learning more about the expungement process in Mecklenburg County, how you get rid of something in your criminal history and whether that needs to change. This conversation continues next on Bounce. Welcome back to Race and Justice, an important community conversation. Now we want to discuss the expungement process, and what we mean by that is how you get rid of a criminal record. Garry McFadden, retired Charlotte-Mecklenburg police detective, and district attorney Spencer Merriweather back with us. So first to you, Spencer, explain how the expungement process works.
So for certain types of people who have committed a nonviolent misdemeanor or a nonviolent felony, there's a given period of time in which they have not committed another offense that they can actually have a record expunged. That means that both the district attorney's office as well as the court, as well as a couple of different other state offices have to certify that there has not been any other arrests or convictions. This gives people the opportunity to get their record clean. That can lift barriers for employment. It can lift barriers for housing. It can lift barriers for all different types of things. Expungements really can be the key to putting people in a place where they can make positive contributions to their community.
How difficult is it?
It can take a while. It can take a few months. What you've seen is there's been a lot of education about expungements recently and a lot of enthusiasm. That enthusiasm has meant people rounding buildings, thousands of people rounding buildings in order to line up for one of these things. Sometimes that enthusiasm results in frustration because people don't realize what it takes to be eligible for one of them. So courthouse partners have been doing what they can along with community organizations to make sure people are educated about eligibility and don't get frustrated, so we can walk people through this process in a way they can understand.
What percentage of defendants are seeking to have drug charges removed or expunged?
Well, as far as the specific drugs, I couldn't tell you those numbers, but I can tell you is that the laws of expungement have actually been expanded. The class of people who qualify for it has been expanded within the last year. My number said the backlog of people waiting to determine their eligibility is something along the lines of 3,000. So we're slowly but surely trying to shrink that number.
And you were talking about community partners and programs that have been created. I know you've been instrumental in creating one of those, Garry, so talk to us about that.
Well, we created, first it was called Council of Elders, but now it's called Mecklenburg Council of Elders. And we came together as a group of people from the very diverse background. And Mrs. Macon brought us together at the Belmont Center, and we sat back and said, what can we really do for our community? And we were that group that had the people wrapped around the building and people standing in line for hours and hours. But I can tell you, one lady, she thanked me when I was getting on my plane one day, and she showed me that she finally got a job. Another young man, he's seeking employment and a resident, but he cannot get it because he has something minor on his record. So things like that, if we can remove them or find some way to help them, I think is vital. But the Council of Elders, when we started, we had that wrapped around the building, but they also came inside and was educated on a lot of things that they didn't know, like who would be eligible and who wouldn't be eligible.
Okay. And I know that you talked about it affecting job searching, but we also want to talk about felons in terms of voting here in North Carolina, because, you know, people have always been told, oh, if you're a felon, you can't vote. And that's not exactly true here in North Carolina. So Spencer, speak to that.
What I can tell you is that if you're not on probation, if you're not on supervised release, pre-trial or post supervised release, you actually do qualify to have all of your rights restored as far as voting is concerned. It's just a matter of re-registering to vote, reapplying for a driver's license. North Carolina is unique in that way among states. A lot of states don't allow that. One more point I wanted to talk about the expungements is to say this. That when you have wonderful community organizations like the Council of Elders that are doing that work, it was important for the courthouse partners, particularly the district attorney's office, to get involved and say, this is a job for government. We need to have people come into the courthouse so that they're not standing around a building waiting for this eligibility. And so it's our hope, and we've already begun this work within the next few months, to have a permanent expungement clinic in the courthouse so that people can take advantage of that. I think it's important that the person who's at the center of the criminal justice system, the district attorney, actually advocate that, because if the DA is behind it, maybe an employer gets behind it, maybe someone who provides housing gets behind it, and people will understand that these are people that need to be put into place to make positive contributions.
Can you speak to the difficulties that people face with getting their record erased? Because I know you're saying it takes time, it can take a few months, people may not recognize that right off the bat. Are there other difficulties that folks are facing when trying to get, you know, again, minor infractions?
Can I add to that? How many slide back into the system on the negative side that don't get it?
That's one of the most frustrating things. I can shut down a barbershop talking about expungements. The number of people who have questions and have concerns and have stories about being on the verge of getting an expunction, and then something just sort of happens. Someone makes a mistake, and sometimes those mistakes are directly tied to the fact that they had a criminal record in the first place. So what we're trying to do through this expungement process is empower people And we're trying to do that as quickly as possible so that we're not letting people just sort of lay out there vulnerable to all of the temptations and making them susceptible to all the things that cause crime.
So it takes a few months. How do you motivate people, encourage people to be patient and to stay the course with this?
Well, I think that what myself and several other people are going to do in the next couple of weeks, a young lady named Tia Brown, she does a thing called Beauty After the Bars. And then also Cedric Dean, who has an organization called SAVE. So we came up with, we're going to have a day where we're going to have people with criminal records to come to a church. And we're going to educate them of what they can do and what they should be doing to get their records expunged. And even what we kind of commonly say off paper, if you can vote. So we're going to educate the community by having these sessions so they will know. Most of the time people just don't know where the resources are. So we want to lead them where these resources are and take the fear out of, I can't vote, I can't get a job, I can't get housing. So we want to take that fear out by educating them.
Okay. Gentlemen, great information. We're wrapping up our community conversation with the question, where do we go from here? We're back in just a few minutes. Welcome back to Race and Justice, a community conversation. We want to wrap up tonight with a question for all of our guests, and simply, where do we go from here?
It takes transparency and re-examining our policies with race in mind.
I think it takes education in the schools and also educating the parents.
Judge Best?
Educating ourselves about implicit bias and eliminating barriers to those returning. 100th class for the Racial Equity Institute. Go to rmjj.org for more information. This collaborative has existed for 10 years now.
Mr. Ferguson?
Back when I served on the Commission for Alternatives to Incarceration, we discovered that most people in jail fell into three categories: those who were African American or other racial minority, those who were not educated and couldn't get a job and couldn't find their way in society, and poor. So if we could eliminate poverty, which we need to do by providing more opportunities, if we can eliminate racial discrimination and get our people educated, we will have gone a great step towards improving our criminal justice system.
Ms. Earls?
Well, as I'm also a voting rights attorney, I have to say, being educated about voting, remember that you elect judges, you elect district attorneys, you elect sheriffs, you elect judges at every level in the state, and that's a really valuable source of power. So know what your candidates stand for and elect people who will put in place policies to address the issues.
This has truly been such a fantastic conversation. I hope you learned something tonight if you're at home watching. I certainly did, yes. Sitting here at the table. So thank you to everyone tonight. We know that you're all incredibly busy and you had plenty of things to do, but we so appreciate you making time to talk about something that we feel so strongly about here at WBTV. Part of our job here is not just to deliver the news, but to have conversations about what's going on in this community. So thank you for being a part of that tonight.
And hopefully create some solutions moving forward. So, thank you for watching our special edition, Race and Justice, a community conversation.
We'll have more news at 11 over on WBTV, and we'll see you back here tomorrow night at 8.